They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that sometimes blood can cut deeper than a knife. One cold autumn morning, I woke up to find my savings, $400,000, every nickel I had scrimped for, gone. And the one who took it was my own son. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting here telling you this story. But life has a way of teaching us lessons we never wanted to learn, doesn't it? Every morning, my small apartment in Queens echoed with silence, except for the hum of the old radiator and the distant noise of city traffic filtering through my thin windows. The smell of brewing coffee was the only semblance of warmth as I shuffled to the kitchen, my arthritic knees protesting with each step on the worn linoleum floor. For decades, I had been the family's anchor, cooking Sunday dinners for ungrateful faces, scheduling doctor's appointments for grandchildren who barely acknowledged me, patching up broken spirits with my own threadbare heart. I felt utterly invisible inside my own home, like a ghost haunting rooms where I once belonged. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, gray hair pulled back severely, deep lines etched by years of worry, eyes that had lost their spark somewhere between raising children and surviving disappointment. That Tuesday morning was supposed to be like any other. I had planned to water my small herb garden on the fire escape, maybe call my sister in Brooklyn, perhaps venture out to the bodega on the corner for fresh bread. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves from Flushing Meadows Park, mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of someone's breakfast. But instead of peace, my phone buzzed with a text that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The message was from David, my 38-year-old son. Just 4 words that froze my breath in my chest. "I'm leaving, Mom. The Porsche is ready." My hands trembled as I read it again, then again, hoping I had misunderstood. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of brown liquid and broken dreams. Memories flooded back like a dam bursting. The faded photograph on my mantle of David as a 7-year-old boy, his bright eyes filled with promise, gap-toothed smile radiating innocence. I could almost smell his favorite cinnamon gum on his breath, feel his small hand clutching mine as we walked through Central Park on autumn afternoons just like this one. How did that little boy become this stranger? How did it come to this? I had planned to retire here peacefully, surrounded by love and laughter, not lose everything to a betrayal so deep it felt like drowning. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the old shoebox where I kept my important documents. With shaking fingers, I found my latest bank statement, the one I had been too afraid to open for weeks. The numbers swam before my eyes, but one figure stood out like a neon sign in the darkness. $400,000. Gone. Every penny I had saved from 40 years of working as a seamstress in the garment district, every dollar I had squeezed from Social Security, every sacrifice I had made to build a nest egg for my golden years, vanished. But let me tell you how we got here, because stories like mine don't happen overnight. They build slowly, like water eroding stone, until one day you wake up and realize you're standing in a canyon of your own making. I remember the long nights working 3 jobs to send David to college in Manhattan. While other mothers my age were sleeping peacefully, I was hunched over my sewing machine in our cramped Brooklyn apartment, taking in alterations and mending to pay for his tuition. My fingers were permanently stained with fabric dye. My back perpetually ached from bending over intricate embroidery work. But I told myself it would all be worth it when he graduated with his business degree. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Mom," he would snap whenever I asked him to help with household expenses or visit his grandmother in the nursing home. His voice carried an edge of entitlement that cut through me like scissors through silk. "College is demanding. I need to focus on my future." My husband Robert had grown distant over the years, too wrapped up in his job as a subway conductor to notice the growing chasm between us and our son. When I tried to talk to him about David's behavior, he would wave his hand dismissively and retreat behind his evening newspaper. "Boys will be boys, Maggie. He'll come around when he's ready." So I forgave. I forgave the missed birthdays, when David would send a hastily written card days late with some excuse about being busy. I forgave the broken promises to visit, the way he would cancel family dinners at the last minute, leaving me staring at a table set for 4 with only 2 chairs occupied. I forgave the cold silences that hung heavy in our brownstone during holidays, the way he would check his phone instead of engaging in conversation, the dismissive way he treated my attempts at affection. "It's just a phase," I would whisper to myself while lying awake at night, listening to Robert's snoring and the sounds of the city outside our bedroom window. He's young. He'll mature. All children go through rebellious periods. But each act of forgiveness chipped away at something inside me, like waves eroding a cliff face. Hope was slowly replaced by an unsettling doubt that gnawed at my stomach during quiet moments. Was I nothing more than a bank to him? A resource to be drained dry and then discarded when no longer useful? The signs were there if I had been willing to see them. The way his eyes would light up when I mentioned having money for emergencies, but glaze over when I talked about my health problems or loneliness. The way he would become suddenly attentive and charming whenever he needed financial help, only to disappear again once his needs were met. The way he spoke about me to others. I overheard him once at his college graduation party describing me as overly emotional and too involved in his life. Still, I clung to the belief that blood meant something, that the child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, cheered for at every school play and sporting event, would never truly abandon me. Love, I thought, had to count for something in this world. After college, David moved to Manhattan and started working for an investment firm. He rented a sleek apartment in Midtown, bought expensive suits, and began talking about stock market investments and cryptocurrency with the confidence of someone who had forgotten where he came from. He would visit occasionally, usually when he needed something: money for a business opportunity, help with a security deposit, a loan to cover some mysterious emergency that was never quite explained. "It's an investment in my future, Mom," he would say, flashing that charming smile that reminded me of the little boy he used to be. "When I make it big, I'll pay you back 10 times over. We'll all be wealthy." And foolishly, desperately, I believed him. Because what choice did I have? He was my son, my only son, and the alternative, accepting that he might not love me the way I loved him, was too painful to consider. The microaggressions started small, almost imperceptible at first. Birthdays passed unacknowledged, not even a phone call, let alone a visit. When I mentioned feeling hurt, he would brush it off with excuses about being busy with work, or suggest that I was being too sensitive about arbitrary dates. "Mom, you're 67 years old," he said during one particularly painful phone conversation. "Don't you think it's time to stop expecting people to make a big fuss over your birthday?" His words stung worse than a physical slap. I had never asked for a fuss, just acknowledgement, just a sign that my existence mattered to him. But I swallowed the hurt and made excuses for him, the way I always did. When I fell ill with pneumonia last winter, spending 3 terrifying days in Elmhurst Hospital, he barely visited. I called him from my hospital bed, my voice weak and raspy, desperately needing to hear his concerned voice, to feel connected to family during the scariest moments of my life. "I'm really busy with a big presentation this week, Mom," he said, the sound of traffic in the background suggesting he was walking somewhere important. "But I'm sure you'll be fine. You're tougher than you think." The smell of antiseptic and disinfectant in that sterile hospital room became the scent of my loneliness. I watched other patients receive visits from children and grandchildren, flowers and get-well cards piling up on their bedside tables, while my own table remained empty except for a wilting plant I had bought for myself from the hospital gift shop. My daughter Sarah lived across the country in Los Angeles, building her own life as a graphic designer. She called more frequently than David, but our conversations were often strained. She seemed caught between loyalty to her brother and concern for me, walking a careful line that satisfied no one. "Maybe you should give David some space, Mom," she would suggest gently during our weekly phone calls. "He's under a lot of pressure trying to establish his career. You know how competitive New York is." Even from 3,000 miles away, she was making excuses for him, and I found myself nodding along, agreeing that perhaps I was expecting too much. Perhaps I was being unfair. The pattern of self-doubt had become so ingrained that I questioned my own perceptions, my own right to feel hurt and abandoned. The day everything changed started like any other. I had spent the morning at the senior center on Northern Boulevard, playing bridge with 3 other women whose own children had disappointed them in various ways. We never talked about it directly, but there was an understanding among us, a recognition of shared pain that needed no words. Mrs. Chen's son had moved to California and called once a month at best. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter was too busy with her own family to visit more than twice a year. Mrs. Patterson's son lived just 20 minutes away, but always had excuses. We formed our own family of sorts, these forgotten mothers, finding comfort in each other's company over cards and coffee. I returned home around 3 in the afternoon, climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment with my usual struggle, and settled into my favorite chair by the window to go through the mail. Bills, advertisements, a postcard from my sister who was vacationing in Florida, all routine until I saw the envelope from my bank. My hands shook as I opened it. Not from arthritis this time, but from a premonition that something was terribly wrong. The bank statement showed activity I didn't recognize. A large withdrawal dated 2 days earlier, $400,000, labeled simply as auto investment transfer. The silence in my tiny apartment became deafening. The usual sounds of Queens, children playing in the courtyard below, the rumble of buses on Roosevelt Avenue, the distant hum of LaGuardia Airport, all faded into background static as I stared at those numbers. $400,000. My entire life savings, accumulated through decades of sacrifice and careful budgeting. Money I had planned to use for medical expenses as I aged, maybe a small inheritance to leave Sarah and David, a cushion to ensure I wouldn't become a burden to anyone in my declining years. Gone. My hands began to tremble so violently that the bank statement fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be some mistake, some clerical error that could be easily explained and corrected. But deep in my heart, I already knew the truth. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. David's recent questions about my bank account, his casual inquiries about my retirement plans, the way he had insisted on helping me set up online banking last month, claiming he wanted to make my life easier. I reached for my old rotary phone, the same one I'd had for 20 years, and dialed David's number with fingers that felt numb and disconnected from my body. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached David. I'm probably closing a deal or living my best life. Leave a message if it's important." The casual arrogance in his recorded voice made my stomach lurch. I hung up without leaving a message and immediately called back. Again, voicemail. On the 4th try, he finally answered. "What is it, Mom? I'm in the middle of something important." "David," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my chest. "I just received my bank statement. There's been a withdrawal I don't understand. $400,000. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long, a silence that confirmed my worst fears. "Oh, that," he said, his tone shifting to something practiced and dismissive. "I can explain. It was an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. Short-term thing. You'll thank me when you see the returns. You took my money without asking me? Borrowed, Mom. Borrowed. And like I said, it's going to pay off big. Trust me on this one." Trust. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. How many times had he asked me to trust him? How many times had I complied, only to end up disappointed, hurt, or in this case, robbed? "I want my money back, David. All of it. Today." His laugh was sharp and cold, nothing like the laughter of the little boy I remembered. "That's not how investments work, Mom. The money is tied up for now. But don't worry, in a few months we'll all be celebrating." "We? There is no we in this, David. That was my money. Money I saved for my retirement, for emergencies. For what? To leave it sitting in some savings account earning pennies in interest? Mom, you're 72 years old. What were you planning to do with all that money anyway?" The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. In his mind, I was already irrelevant, my needs and dreams dismissed because of my age. I was just an old woman whose money could be put to better use by someone younger, someone more deserving. "I was planning to live," I whispered. "Well, now you can live knowing your money is actually working for you. Look, I have to go. I'm meeting some investors about expanding the portfolio. We'll talk later when you're feeling more rational." The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling something inside me crack and splinter like ice on a frozen pond. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered around my apartment, touching objects that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The china cabinet filled with dishes I'd collected over decades, hoping to pass them down to future generations. The photo albums chronicling David's childhood, every milestone carefully documented and preserved, the sewing machine where I'd spent countless hours creating clothes and memories. I opened the album to a picture of David's 8th birthday party. He was wearing a cowboy costume I had sewn by hand, his face bright with joy as he blew out candles on a cake I had spent all day decorating. Robert stood behind him with a proud smile, and I was leaning in close, my younger self radiating the kind of happiness that comes from believing your sacrifices matter. Where had that family gone? When had love transformed into transaction? When had my son learned to see me as a resource rather than a person? I made myself a cup of tea, the same ritual that had comforted me through countless difficult nights. The familiar motions, filling the kettle, selecting a tea bag, waiting for the whistle, usually brought peace. But tonight, even these small comforts felt hollow. As I sat at my kitchen table holding the warm mug between my cold hands, I realized something had shifted inside me. The shock was giving way to something else, a quiet fury that burned steady and clean. For the first time in my adult life, I was angry at David not as a frustrated mother, but as a person who had been wronged. The next morning brought another text message. Flying out to close some deals. Don't worry about the investment, it's already showing returns. Love you. Love you. 2 words that had once meant everything to me, now feeling like a mockery. If this was love, then I had spent my entire life misunderstanding the word. I spent that day doing something I had never done before. I fought back. My first call was to the bank, where I spoke with a manager named Mrs. Foster, who listened with professional sympathy as I explained the situation. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan, but the withdrawals were made with proper authorization. Your son has been listed as an authorized user on your account since last month. Do you remember signing documents to that effect? I did remember, vaguely. David had brought papers to me one evening, explaining that it would make it easier for him to help me with banking if I ever became unable to manage my finances myself. He had called it planning ahead, making it sound responsible and caring. However, Mrs. Foster continued, we can remove his access immediately and flag your account for any future unauthorized activity. Would you like me to do that now? Yes, I said, the word coming out stronger than I felt. Yes, please do that. My next call was to the legal aid office in downtown Queens. The young lawyer who took my case, Maria Santos, had kind eyes and a patient voice that reminded me of Sarah when she was younger. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to be honest with you. Because your son had legal access to the account, this becomes a civil matter rather than a criminal one. However, we can help you explore your options for recovery. What does that mean? It means we can demand the money back legally, and if he refuses, we can take him to court. But it's a process that could take months or even years, especially if the money has been invested or spent. Months or years. Time I might not have. But what choice did I have? I signed the papers that would start the legal proceedings and walked out of that office feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. The sense that I was fighting for myself. That evening, I called Sarah in Los Angeles. She listened in shocked silence as I told her what had happened. Mom, that can't be right. David wouldn't... he's made some mistakes, but he wouldn't steal from you. It's not stealing if it's legal, apparently, but it's still gone, Sarah. All of it. Maybe he's telling the truth about the investment. Maybe... Sarah, I interrupted, hearing the steel in my own voice. Stop making excuses for him. I taught you both better than this. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice smaller. You're right, Mom. I'm sorry. What can I do to help? For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of connection with one of my children. Just don't abandon me, honey. I need to know that someone in this family still cares about me as more than a bank account. Of course, Mom. Of course I care. I love you. And when Sarah said those words, they felt real in a way that David's text message hadn't. Love, I was learning, wasn't just words. It was actions, respect, consideration for someone else's dignity and needs. The confrontation I had been dreading came 3 days later. David returned from his mysterious business trip and appeared at my door unannounced, carrying flowers and wearing the charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. Hi, Mom. I brought you these, he said, holding out a bouquet of roses that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I don't want your flowers, David. I want my money. His smile faltered slightly. Can I come in? We need to talk about this rationally. Against my better judgment, I let him enter. He settled onto my couch as if nothing had changed, as if he still belonged in my space and my life without question. Mom, I know you're upset, but you need to trust me on this. I've invested your money in a cryptocurrency venture that's already showing tremendous returns. In 6 months, that $400,000 could be worth over $1 million. Could be. Or could be worth nothing. That's not going to happen. I have inside information, reliable sources. David, stop. I sat down across from him, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. Even if everything you're saying is true, even if this investment makes us both millionaires, you stole from me. I didn't steal anything. I used money that was just sitting there doing nothing to create wealth for both of us. You took my security without asking. You violated my trust. You made a decision about my future without including me in that decision. He leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. Mom, do you want to spend your golden years pinching pennies and worrying about medical bills? Or do you want to live comfortably knowing your money is working? I want to live knowing that my son respects me enough to ask before making decisions about my life. Fine, he said, standing up abruptly. I can see you're too emotional to discuss this rationally right now. But when you're counting your profits in a few months, you'll thank me. He headed toward the door, then turned back with an expression that chilled me to the bone. It was cold, calculating, utterly without love or warmth. And Mom? I'd be careful about making too much noise about this. People might start to think you're getting senile, making up stories about your own son. That would be embarrassing for everyone. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He was suggesting that if I continued to fight him, he would portray me as a confused old woman, losing her grip on reality. It was a fear that haunted many women my age. The terror of being dismissed as senile, of having our concerns and complaints attributed to mental decline rather than legitimate grievances. After he left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the scent of roses I didn't want, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The apartment that had been my sanctuary for 15 years suddenly felt like a prison, the walls closing in on me with their memories of better times. But something else was growing inside me alongside the loneliness, a determination I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting to make a life for my family in a new country. I thought about the photograph of David as a little boy, the one where he was smiling with such innocent joy. That child was gone, had been gone for years, but I had been holding on to the ghost of him, letting that ghost manipulate and use me. It was time to let the ghost go. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I called the police. Officer Martinez, a middle-aged woman with patient eyes, listened as I explained the situation. "Ma'am, like the bank told you, this appears to be a civil matter since he had legal access to the account. But given the amount of money involved and some of the details you've shared, I can connect you with a detective who specializes in financial crimes. There might be more options than you realize." Detective Rodriguez was a soft-spoken man about Sarah's age who met me at my apartment that afternoon. He listened carefully as I told my story, taking notes and asking pointed questions about David's behavior and statements. "Mrs. Sullivan, your son mentioned having inside information about investments. Can you remember his exact words?" I thought back to our confrontation. He said he had reliable sources, inside information about cryptocurrency. That could constitute securities fraud, especially if he's used your money for illegal trading activities. And if he's moved any of the funds across international borders, that brings federal agencies into play. My heart began to race. Federal agencies? The FBI handles financial crimes that cross state or international boundaries. And if there's evidence of money laundering or wire fraud, other agencies might get involved. Would you be willing to cooperate with a federal investigation? I thought about David's threats, his suggestion that I was becoming senile, his casual dismissal of my rights and dignity. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I would." That evening, I called Sarah to update her on the day's developments. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining about the police and the potential federal investigation. "Mom, are you sure about this? I mean, David is still my brother. This could destroy his career, maybe send him to prison." "Sarah, he destroyed his relationship with me when he decided I was worth more to him as a source of money than as a mother. I didn't break this family. He did. But what if he's telling the truth about the investment? What if he was genuinely trying to help?" I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of doubt and guilt. How many times had I made excuses for him? How many times had I prioritized his comfort over my own dignity? "Sweetheart, even if his intentions were good, which I doubt, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He took my money without permission. He threatened me when I objected. He showed no concern for my security or peace of mind. Those are not the actions of someone who loves me." "I know, Mom. I know you're right. I keep hoping there's some explanation that makes this all make sense." The explanation is simple. Your brother has learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, and I've finally learned to see him clearly too. The federal investigation moved slowly but thoroughly. Agent Patterson from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was a woman about my age who had clearly dealt with family financial abuse before. "Mrs. Sullivan, we see cases like this more often than you might think. Adult children who exploit elderly parents' trust and resources. The emotional manipulation you've described is textbook behavior." Over the next several weeks, I learned things about my son that shattered whatever illusions I had left about his character. The cryptocurrency investment was real, but it was part of an illegal scheme to manipulate digital currency prices. David hadn't just used my money. He had used funds from several other investors, including 2 other elderly clients from his former job at the investment firm. "He's been operating what amounts to a Ponzi scheme," Agent Patterson explained during one of our meetings, using new investors' money to pay returns to earlier investors, all while skimming substantial amounts for his personal use. "The Porsche," I said, remembering his text message. "Among other things, we've traced purchases of luxury goods, expensive vacations, and a deposit on a Manhattan penthouse apartment. My life savings had been converted into symbols of success for a son who had decided that his desires mattered more than my security. The betrayal was complete." But perhaps even worse than the financial crime was the discovery of text messages between David and his girlfriend. Messages that federal agents had obtained as part of their investigation. "She's so gullible," one message read. "I told her it was an investment, and she fell for it completely. By the time she figures out what happened, I'll be living in Mexico." Another message was even more cruel. "The old lady has been a gold mine. Between the loans over the years and this final score, I've gotten over $500,000 out of her. Time to cut ties and disappear." Agent Patterson showed me these messages with gentle professionalism, but I could see the disgust in her eyes. She had children too, probably couldn't imagine treating her own mother with such casual cruelty. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to know that your son has purchased a plane ticket to Cancun departing tomorrow morning. We believe he's planning to flee the country." The room spun around me. Even after everything, some part of me had hoped that David would come to his senses, would realize what he had done to the woman who had given him life and love. But he was preparing to run, to disappear with my money, and leave me with nothing but memories of a son who had never really existed. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we stop him." The next morning, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint queens in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere across the city, David was probably packing his bags, checking his watch, preparing to board a plane that would take him away from the consequences of his actions. But Agent Patterson had assured me that wouldn't happen. Interpol, the international police organization, had been notified. David's passport had been flagged. Even if he managed to leave the country, he wouldn't be able to stay gone. My phone rang at 10:30 a.m. Agent Patterson's voice was professionally calm, but I could hear satisfaction underneath. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted you to know that your son has been arrested at JFK Airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Mexico when airport security detained him." I felt something release in my chest, a tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. What happens next? "He'll be arraigned on federal charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Given the amount of money involved and the fact that he was attempting to flee prosecution, it's unlikely he'll be granted bail." After hanging up, I sat in silence for a long time. The apartment felt different somehow. Lighter, as if a oppressive presence had been lifted from it. For months, I had been living under the weight of David's betrayal and my own self-doubt. But now, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something approaching peace. That afternoon, Sarah called from Los Angeles. She had heard about David's arrest from the FBI agents who had contacted her as part of their investigation. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you completely. I'm sorry I made excuses for him. I'm sorry I let you face this alone. You didn't know, sweetheart. None of us really knew who he had become. I'm flying out tomorrow. I want to be there with you." "You don't need to do that, hon. I know you have your own life." "Mom," she interrupted, "you're my mother. After everything you've done for our family, everything you've sacrificed, the least I can do is be there when you need me. I should have been there all along." When Sarah arrived the next evening, she looked older than as if learning the truth about her brother had aged her. But her hug was warm and real, filled with the kind of love I had been starving for without realizing it. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a small wrapped package from her bag. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with a simple message. "Strong women raise strong women." "I had it made after our last phone call," she explained. "You've been through hell, Mom, but you fought back. You stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to keep being a victim. That takes strength I'm not sure I would have had." That night, we sat in my living room talking until nearly dawn. Sarah told me about her job, her life in California, her hopes and fears. But more importantly, she listened as I talked about my loneliness, my regrets, my dreams for whatever years I had left. "I've been thinking," she said as the morning light began to filter through my windows. "Maybe it's time you came to visit me in Los Angeles. Not to move there permanently, but just to see something different. To remember that there's a whole world beyond this neighborhood." The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. When had I become so small, so contained within these few blocks of Queens? When had I stopped dreaming of new places and experiences? "I'd like that," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and emotionally exhausting. David's attorney tried to plea bargain, painting him as a young man who had made poor decisions under pressure. But the evidence was overwhelming. The illegal investment scheme, the deliberate deception of elderly investors, the attempt to flee prosecution. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I had agonized over what to say, how to put into words the depth of betrayal and loss I felt. "Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. The defendant is my son. I gave birth to him, raised him, made countless sacrifices to help him succeed in life. I taught him about right and wrong, about treating others with respect and kindness. But somewhere along the way, he learned different lessons. He learned that elderly people are easy targets. He learned that family relationships can be exploited for financial gain. He learned that love is a weakness to be manipulated rather than a gift to be treasured. I lost $400,000 to his crimes, money I had saved over decades of hard work. But what I lost that was far more valuable was my trust, my sense of safety in my own family, my belief that the child I raised still existed somewhere inside the man who robbed me. I don't ask for your sympathy, Your Honor. I ask for justice. Not just for me, but for every elderly person who might become his victim if he's allowed to continue this behavior. And I ask that he be given the time and help he needs to remember the values he once knew. David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. As the judge read the sentence, I watched my son's face crumble with the reality of what he had done to his own life. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little boy I had loved, and my heart broke one final time. But I didn't go to him. I didn't try to comfort him or promise to wait for him. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. The recovery of my money was partial and slow. The federal government seized David's assets, the Porsche, his bank accounts, even his expensive watches and jewelry. Combined with restitution from the other defendants in the scheme, I eventually recovered about 60% of what I had lost. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough. Enough to secure my immediate future, enough to regain some independence, enough to feel like I hadn't been completely defeated. More importantly, I had discovered something about myself that I had forgotten or perhaps never known. I was stronger than I had realized. I had stood up to someone I loved when they were hurting me. I had navigated federal law enforcement and legal proceedings. I had refused to be a victim. 6 months after David's sentencing, I took that trip to Los Angeles that Sarah had suggested. I spent 3 weeks in California, staying in her guest room, exploring the city, meeting her friends, remembering what it felt like to be seen as a complete person rather than just someone's elderly mother. On my last evening there, we sat on her balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The air was warm and dry, so different from the humid summers of New York. "I've been thinking about getting a place out here," I said, surprising myself with the words. "Not full-time, maybe just a little apartment I could use for part of the year." Sarah turned to me with wide eyes. "Really? You'd consider leaving New York?" "I'd consider expanding my world," I corrected. "Queens will always be home, but maybe home can be bigger than I thought." With part of the recovered money, I did eventually buy a small condo in a retirement community near Sarah's apartment. Not to escape my life in New York, but to add to it. For the first time in decades, I had options, possibilities, a future that extended beyond the narrow confines I had accepted for too long. Back in Queens, I made other changes too. I joined a support group for victims of family financial abuse, discovering that my story, while painful, was far from unique. I met other elderly people who had been exploited by children, spouses, and caregivers they trusted. Together, we shared our experiences and learned to reclaim our dignity. I also began volunteering at the senior center, helping other elderly people understand their legal rights and recognize signs of financial abuse. My experience with federal law enforcement and legal proceedings, traumatic as it had been, became a resource I could offer to others facing similar situations. The hardest part, I would tell them, isn't the money. Money can sometimes be recovered, replaced, managed differently. The hardest part is accepting that someone you loved saw you as a thing to be used rather than a person to be cherished. But once you accept that truth, you can start to rebuild. One of the most profound changes came from an unexpected source. Lily, my neighbor's granddaughter who had always been kind to me, began stopping by more frequently after David's arrest. She was a college student studying social work, and my situation had opened her eyes to issues of elder abuse she had never considered. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said one day over tea in my kitchen, "would you consider telling your story to my social work class? I think it would help them understand how these situations develop and how families can prevent them." Speaking to those young students was terrifying at first, but also empowering. Their shock and outrage at David's behavior validated my own feelings in a way that years of self-doubt had undermined. These future social workers and counselors would go into their careers with a better understanding of how financial abuse happens and how to help victims find justice. One young woman approached me after my presentation with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother has been giving my cousin large amounts of money, and we've been worried that he's taking advantage of her. Your story helps me understand that we need to intervene, even if it's uncomfortable." Knowing that my painful experience might prevent someone else from suffering the same fate gave meaning to what I had endured. The most unexpected twist came almost a year after David's imprisonment. I received a call from Agent Patterson, who had remained in touch to update me on the investigation and recovery efforts. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've discovered something interesting. It appears your son wasn't working alone in some of these investment schemes. We've uncovered evidence that your husband may have been aware of and possibly involved in some of the financial improprieties." My blood turned to ice. Robert, my husband of 45 years, the man who had retreated behind his newspaper whenever I tried to discuss our son's behavior, had he known what David was doing? Had he been part of it? "What kind of evidence?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Bank records show that your husband received several payments from accounts connected to your son's fraudulent investment scheme. We're talking about significant amounts of money, Mrs. Sullivan. $25,000 over the past year." The betrayal was so complete, so overwhelming that I couldn't speak for several moments. It wasn't just David who had seen me as a resource to be exploited. It was both of them, father and son, working together to drain me dry while pretending to love me. That evening, when Robert came home from his job at the Transit Authority, I was sitting at our kitchen table with the bank records spread in front of me. He took one look at the papers and sank into his chair like a deflated balloon. "Maggie, I can explain." "Don't," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me. 45 years of marriage, Robert. 45 years. And you were stealing from me along with our son." "It wasn't stealing. David said the investments were legitimate, that we'd all profit from them. He was paying me a finder's fee for helping him access your account. A finder's fee for betraying your wife." Robert's shoulders sagged. For the first time in our marriage, he looked genuinely ashamed. "I know how it looks, Maggie. But I thought it would work out. I thought we'd all come out ahead. Even if that were true, even if these had been legitimate investments, you conspired with our son to use my money without my knowledge or consent. You made me the only person in this family who wasn't part of the decision." The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. After everything I had learned about standing up for myself, I wasn't about to spend my remaining years with someone who had proven he couldn't be trusted. The house in Brooklyn went on the market, and I used my share of the proceeds to pay for the Los Angeles condo and to rebuild my depleted savings. Robert moved in with his sister in the Bronx. He tried several times to contact me, to apologize and ask for forgiveness, but I was done accepting apologies from men who had mistaken my love for weakness. The house sale yielded another surprise. While cleaning out the basement, I discovered a box of investment documents that Robert had hidden behind his workbench. The papers revealed that he had been using my Social Security checks to make unauthorized stock purchases for years, skimming profits and manipulating our joint accounts in ways I had never suspected. The extent of the financial deception was staggering. Not only had David stolen my retirement savings, but Robert had been quietly embezzling from our household expenses for nearly a decade. Together, they had stolen nearly $600,000 from me over time. Agent Patterson was fascinated by this new evidence. "Mrs. Sullivan, this changes the scope of the investigation significantly. We're looking at a multi-year conspiracy now, not just a single incident of fraud." Robert was arrested 3 months later, charged as a co-conspirator in David's investment scheme, plus additional charges related to his unauthorized use of my Social Security benefits. The man I had shared a bed with for 4 decades, who I had trusted with my financial security and my emotional well-being, was led away in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. The local news stations picked up the story. Queens woman discovers husband and son stole $600,000 in elaborate financial scheme. For a few days, I was a minor celebrity, the elderly victim who had fought back against family financial abuse. Reporters wanted to interview me. Prosecutors held me up as an example of successful victim advocacy. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of betrayal, tired of legal proceedings, tired of discovering that people I had loved were strangers wearing familiar faces. The second trial was harder than the first. Testifying against my husband felt like dismantling my own history, acknowledging that decades of shared life had been built on lies and exploitation. But I did it, because someone had to speak for the woman who had been systematically robbed by the men she trusted most. Robert received a lighter sentence than David, 4 years in federal prison, plus restitution and supervised probation. During his sentencing hearing, he looked older and frailer than I had ever seen him. When he spoke, his voice was broken with genuine remorse. "Your Honor, I destroyed the most important thing in my life, my marriage to a woman who deserved so much better than what I gave her. I let greed and poor judgment turn me into someone I never thought I could be. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want Margaret to know that I'm sorry, truly, deeply sorry for the pain I've caused." I listened to his apology without emotion. Sorrow was just another word now, meaningless after so much deception. I had cried all the tears I was going to cry for Robert Sullivan, but from those ashes of betrayal and loss, something beautiful began to grow. With the full scope of the theft finally revealed and legal proceedings complete, the federal recovery efforts were more successful than anyone had expected. Asset seizures, insurance settlements, and restitution payments eventually recovered nearly 80% of what had been stolen from me over the years. More importantly, I discovered that I had resources beyond money that no one could steal: resilience, intelligence, the capacity for new relationships and experiences. At 73 years old, I was starting over, and for the first time in decades, I was excited about the future. Sarah and I grew closer than we had ever been. She spent Christmas with me in my Los Angeles condo that first year after Robert's conviction, and we established new holiday traditions that belonged to us rather than to the painful memories of the past. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she told me as we watched the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. "I know that sounds strange coming from a daughter to her mother, but I am. You showed more courage in the past 2 years than most people show in a lifetime." "I had good teachers," I replied. "You, for one. Agent Patterson. The other women in my support group. I learned that asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom." At the Senior Center in Queens, I began leading a monthly workshop called Protecting Yourself from Family Financial Abuse. The room was always full. Elderly people eager to learn how to recognize warning signs and protect their assets from exploitation by relatives. "The hardest lesson," I would tell them, "is that love doesn't protect you from abuse. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we love most. But that doesn't mean we have to accept being hurt. We can love someone and still protect ourselves from them." One woman, Mrs. Kim, approached me after a workshop with tears in her eyes. "My son has been pressuring me to give him access to my bank account so he can help me pay bills. After hearing your story, I realized that I need to be more careful." Another participant, an 80-year-old man named Frank, told me that my presentation had helped him understand that his daughter's constant requests for loans were actually a pattern of financial exploitation. "I thought I was being generous," he said. "I didn't realize I was being robbed." These conversations reminded me that my painful experience had value beyond my own healing. It could serve as a warning and guide for others facing similar situations. The most profound change in my life came from an unexpected source. At the Los Angeles Senior Center near my condo, I met a man named James Chen. He was 75 years old, a retired engineer whose wife had died 3 years earlier. Like me, he was rebuilding his life after loss and betrayal, though his had been a different kind of betrayal, as his late wife had hidden a gambling addiction that left him financially devastated. James and I became friends gradually, bonding over our shared experience of starting over in our 70s. He had the kind of gentle strength that I had never experienced in a relationship. He was interested in my thoughts and feelings without trying to fix or change me, supportive without being controlling. "I think the hardest part of aging," he told me one afternoon as we walked along the Santa Monica Pier, "is that people stop seeing you as a complete person. You become just an old man, or just someone's father, or just a retiree. They forget that you still have dreams and desires and opinions that matter." His words resonated deeply with me. For too many years, I had allowed myself to be reduced to just a mother, just a wife, just a source of support for others. I had forgotten that I was Margaret Sullivan, a complete person with my own needs and wants and rights. James and I began traveling together. Day trips at first, then weekend getaways. Eventually, longer journeys to places neither of us had ever seen. We visited the Grand Canyon, toured historic sites in Washington, D.C., spent a week in Hawaii watching whales and learning about volcanic geology. "Is this what happiness feels like?" I asked him one evening as we sat on a beach in Maui, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "I think so," he replied, taking my hand. "I think this is what it feels like when you're not spending all your energy protecting yourself from the people who are supposed to love you." We married on my 75th birthday in a simple ceremony on the beach in California, with Sarah as my maid of honor and James's daughter Susan as his best woman. It was nothing like my first wedding. No elaborate church ceremony, no expensive dress, no reception for hundreds of distant relatives. Just two people who had found each other late in life, promising to cherish and respect each other for whatever time we had left. "I'm not looking for someone to take care of me," I told James during our engagement. "I've learned to take care of myself. I want someone to share life with, someone who sees me as an equal partner." "That's exactly what I want too," he replied. "I'm too old for games and too wise for anything less than honest love." Our marriage works because we both came to it as whole people rather than broken halves looking to be completed. We maintain our separate homes, I still keep my apartment in Queens and my condo in Los Angeles. He has his place in Pasadena. But we spend most of our time together, traveling and exploring and simply enjoying each other's company. David was released from federal prison after serving 6 years of his sentence. He contacted me through Sarah, asking if I would meet with him to make amends. Part of me was curious to see what prison had done to my son, whether the experience had taught him anything about the pain he had caused. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Manhattan, with Sarah present as a buffer between us. David looked older, grayer, worn down in ways that went beyond the physical effects of incarceration. When he spoke, his voice carried a humility I had never heard from him before. "Mom, I know I can't undo what I did to you. I know I destroyed our relationship and hurt you in ways that probably can't be forgiven. I'm not asking for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for the chance to tell you that I understand now how wrong I was." I listened without interrupting as he talked about his time in prison, the financial counseling and therapy he had received, his gradual understanding of how his behavior had affected not just me, but all of his victims. I told myself I was smart, that I was just using resources that were being wasted, he said. But the truth is that I stopped seeing you as my mother and started seeing you as a mark. That's unforgivable. When he finished speaking, I sat quietly for several moments. The young man across from me bore little resemblance to the arrogant, entitled person who had stolen my life savings. Prison had humbled him in ways that nothing else could have. "David," I finally said, "I appreciate you taking responsibility for what you did, but I need you to understand that my forgiveness isn't something you can earn back. It's not a debt that can be repaid with good behavior or sincere apologies." His face fell, but he nodded. "I understand. However," I continued, "I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm not carrying anger towards you anymore because that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. I've moved on with my life, and I hope you can build something meaningful with yours." We didn't reconcile. We didn't rebuild our relationship, but we ended that conversation with a kind of peace that allowed us both to move forward, without the weight of unfinished business. Robert was released from prison a year later. He also asked to meet with me, also through Sarah as an intermediary, but I declined. Some betrayals run too deep for conversation to bridge. He had been my husband, my life partner, and he had conspired against me with our own son. That level of deception didn't warrant the dignity of a reconciliation meeting. Instead, I sent him a letter through his probation officer. It was brief and to the point. "Robert, I received your request to meet, and I appreciate that you want to make amends. However, I've built a new life that doesn't have space in it for people who have proven they can't be trusted. I wish you well in your rehabilitation, but our marriage and our connection ended the day I discovered your deception. Please respect my decision and don't contact me again." I never heard from him after that, which told me that perhaps he had finally learned to respect my boundaries. As I write this, I am 78 years old. James and I have been married for 3 years, and they have been the happiest years of my adult life. We're planning a trip to Ireland next spring, a journey to explore the homeland my grandparents left behind when they immigrated to America a century ago. Sarah visits us several times a year, and our relationship has evolved into something deeper and more honest than it was when she was growing up. She sees me not just as her mother, but as a woman who survived betrayal and built something beautiful from the wreckage. "I used to worry about you being alone after Dad and David went to prison," she told me recently, "but I realize now that you were never truly alone. You had yourself, and you turned out to be stronger than any of us realized. The financial security I worked so hard to build has been largely restored through legal restitution and my own efforts to rebuild my savings. But more importantly, I've learned that my security doesn't depend on money in the bank. It depends on my ability to recognize my own worth and protect it from people who would exploit it. I still live in Queens part of the year, in a smaller apartment that feels more like home than the house I shared with Robert ever did. I've decorated it with artwork from my travels with James, photographs of genuine friends and family, books I'm reading for pleasure rather than distraction. The senior center where I teach my financial safety workshops has become a second home. The women and men who attend my sessions are survivors like me, people who have learned that family doesn't guarantee love and that love doesn't guarantee safety. The most important lesson, I tell them, is that you're never too old to start over. You're never too old to demand better treatment. You're never too old to walk away from people who don't value you. I think often about the woman I was 5 years ago, scared, isolated, allowing herself to be diminished by people who should have cherished her. That woman feels like a stranger to me now, someone I remember with compassion but don't recognize in the mirror. The person I see in the mirror today is someone who learned to fight for herself, someone who discovered that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Someone who realized that love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation wearing a familiar face. My story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. David and Robert didn't transform into loving family members who recognized their mistakes and made them right. The money I lost wasn't magically restored with interest. The years of manipulation and betrayal left scars that will never fully fade. But what I found was something more valuable than a happy ending. I found myself. I found my voice, my strength, my right to take up space in the world as a complete person deserving of respect and consideration. I found love with someone who sees me as an equal partner rather than a resource to be managed or exploited. I found purpose in helping other elderly people protect themselves from the kinds of abuse I suffered. I found adventure in traveling to places I'd only dreamed of seeing. Most importantly, I found peace. Not the peace of a life without conflict, but the peace that comes from knowing you're strong enough to handle whatever conflicts arise. The peace of knowing that you won't abandon yourself even when others abandon you. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pursuing legal action against David and Robert, if I wish I had tried harder to work things out within the family. The answer is always no. Protecting yourself from abuse isn't a betrayal of family, it's an affirmation of your right to exist with dignity. Some bridges once burned cannot and should not be rebuilt. Some relationships once poisoned by betrayal are healthier when they end. Some forms of love are actually forms of control, and walking away from them is an act of self-preservation, not selfishness. I want to end by asking you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you loved was treating you not as a person but as a resource? Have you ever made excuses for behavior that hurt you because confronting it felt too scary or too complicated? Have you ever known someone, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, who seemed to be giving more than they were receiving, who seemed to be diminishing themselves to accommodate family members who took their sacrifice for granted? If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know that you're not alone. Financial abuse of elderly people by family members is more common than most people realize, and it thrives in silence and shame. But silence and shame aren't your responsibility to maintain. You deserve better than being seen as a resource rather than a person. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. You deserve to feel valued for who you are, not just for what you can provide. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to seek help. It's never too late to start over. If you found something valuable in my story, if it helped you think differently about your own situation or someone you love, please consider sharing it. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and help these stories reach people who need to hear them. We survivors need to support each other, to share our experiences and our strength. Together, we can break the cycle of silence that allows elder abuse to flourish in families across the country. But I want to tell you about the unexpected gifts that came from this nightmare, because they're just as important as the pain. These gifts might seem impossible to imagine when you're in the middle of your own crisis, but they're real, and they're waiting for you on the other side. The first gift was clarity. For so many years, I had been confused about my relationships, making excuses for behavior that hurt me, second-guessing my own perceptions. When David stole my money and Robert betrayed my trust, their true characters were revealed in stark, undeniable terms. There was no more ambiguity, no more wondering if I was being too sensitive or expecting too much. The truth, however painful, set me free from years of self-doubt. The second gift was discovering my own strength. I had spent decades thinking of myself as someone who needed protection, someone who depended on others for security and validation. But when I had to navigate the legal system, testify in federal court, rebuild my finances, and start my life over at 73, I discovered that I was far more capable than I had ever imagined. The strength had always been there. I had just never been forced to use it. The third gift was authentic relationships. Once I learned to recognize the difference between genuine care and manipulation, I became much better at surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. My friendship with James, my deeper connection with Sarah, my relationships with the women in my support group, these were built on mutual respect and honest communication in ways my previous relationships had never been. The fourth gift was freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't responsible for managing anyone else's emotions or making excuses for anyone else's behavior. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to prevent conflict, or sacrificing my own needs to keep peace. I could speak honestly, set boundaries, and live according to my own values without worrying about how it would affect David's mood or Robert's comfort. The fifth gift was purpose. My experience with financial abuse, traumatic as it was, gave me something meaningful to offer other people facing similar situations. Every time I spoke at a workshop or helped someone recognize warning signs in their own life, my pain was transformed into something useful. The worst thing that happened to me became the source of my greatest contribution to others. The sixth gift was adventure. Without the weight of dysfunctional relationships holding me down, I was free to explore parts of myself and the world that I had ignored for decades. Learning to travel with James, taking photography classes, joining a book club, volunteering at the literacy center. These weren't just activities to fill time. They were expressions of who I was when I wasn't busy managing other people's needs. The seventh gift was peace. Not the absence of problems, but the deep calm that comes from knowing you can handle whatever problems arise. I no longer lived in fear of confrontation or abandonment because I had survived the worst confrontations and abandonment that life could offer. I knew now that I could take care of myself, that my worth didn't depend on other people's approval, and that being alone was better than being with people who didn't treat me well. But perhaps the greatest gift was the expansion of my understanding of love itself. For most of my life, I had confused love with sacrifice, believing that the more I gave up for someone, the more I loved them. I had thought that accepting mistreatment was loyalty, that enabling bad behavior was compassion, that losing myself in relationships was devotion. Now, I understand that real love, the kind James and I share, the kind Sarah and I have developed, is based on respect, honesty, and mutual support. Real love doesn't ask you to diminish yourself to make someone else comfortable. Real love doesn't exploit trust or manipulate emotions. Real love sees you as a complete person with your own needs, desires, and boundaries, and it honors those even when they're inconvenient. This revelation transformed not just my understanding of romantic love, but my relationship with myself. I learned that self-love isn't selfish. It's the foundation that makes all other healthy relationships possible. You can't give someone something you don't have. And if you don't value yourself, you can't teach others to value you. I think about the nights I spent lying awake after David stole my savings, feeling like my life was over, like I had nothing left to live for. That woman could never have imagined the richness and joy that were waiting for her just a few years in the future. She couldn't have predicted that losing everything she thought mattered would lead her to discover what actually mattered. The money was important. Financial security matters, especially for elderly people with limited ability to earn more income. But the money was replaceable in ways that self-respect and authentic relationships are not. The real treasure that David and Robert stole from me wasn't the $400,000. It was years of my life that I spent doubting myself, accepting mistreatment, and believing I deserved less than I did. But even those lost years served a purpose. They taught me to recognize the difference between love and manipulation, between family and exploitation, between loyalty and enabling. Without that painful education, I might have continued the same patterns indefinitely, never discovering what healthy relationships actually feel like. Today, I'm grateful for the courage I found to fight back. Even when fighting felt overwhelming and frightening, I'm grateful for Sarah's support, for Agent Patterson's professionalism, for James's companionship, for every person who helped me remember that I deserved better treatment. I'm grateful for the long process of healing, which taught me patience with myself and compassion for other survivors. I'm grateful for the legal system that held David and Robert accountable. Even though I know not every victim has access to the same resources I did, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my story, because I know there are people listening who need to hear that survival is possible, that starting over is possible, that finding happiness after betrayal is possible. But most of all, I'm grateful for the woman I became, not despite what happened to me, but because of how I chose to respond to what happened to me. The woman who was victimized by her own family is not the same woman who stands here today. She was smaller, more fearful, more willing to accept less than she deserved. The woman I am now is larger, braver, and absolutely certain of her own worth. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when I wanted to give up and retreat into old patterns of thinking and behaving. Healing isn't linear. It's messy and unpredictable and sometimes frustrating. There were days when I missed the familiar dysfunction of my old life, when the uncertainty of building something new felt scarier than the familiar pain of accepting mistreatment. Change, even positive change, involves loss, and I had to grieve not just for the family relationships I had lost, but for the illusions about those relationships that I had carried for decades. I had to learn new ways of thinking about myself and my place in the world. For 72 years, I had defined myself primarily in relation to other people, as Robert's wife, David, and Sarah's mother, my parents' daughter. When those relationships ended or changed dramatically, I had to discover who Margaret Sullivan was when she wasn't busy taking care of everyone else. That process of self-discovery was both terrifying and exhilarating. I found interest I had forgotten I had, opinions I had suppressed to avoid conflict, dreams I had abandoned to focus on other people's needs. I started taking evening classes at the community college, learning about art history and creative writing. I joined a hiking group for seniors and discovered that my arthritic knees were stronger than I had thought. I learned to cook for one without feeling sad about eating alone. Each small act of independence built my confidence and expanded my sense of possibility. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in ways I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman with my whole life ahead of me. The legal proceedings, difficult as they were, also played an important role in my healing. Testifying against David and Robert forced me to articulate clearly what they had done to me, which helped me understand that their behavior was wrong, not just unfortunate or misunderstood. The judge's sentences validated my experience and confirmed that society recognized their actions as serious crimes. But perhaps even more importantly, the process taught me to advocate for myself, to speak up when I was being treated poorly, to demand the respect and consideration I deserved. These skills served me well beyond the courtroom, helping me establish better boundaries in all my relationships. The financial recovery, while partial, was also healing in practical terms. Having some economic security restored gave me options and reduced my anxiety about the future. It allowed me to take the trips with James, to buy the condo in Los Angeles, to donate to causes I cared about, to live with dignity rather than just survival. But the emotional recovery was even more valuable than the financial recovery. Learning to trust myself again, to believe that my perceptions were accurate and my feelings were valid, to recognize manipulative behavior and respond appropriately, these skills were worth more than any amount of money. The support group I joined was instrumental in this process. Hearing other people's stories of family financial abuse helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that intelligent, loving people can fall victim to exploitation by family members, that being victimized doesn't reflect a character flaw or weakness. The other group members became a chosen family of sorts, people who understood the particular pain of being betrayed by loved ones, who could offer practical advice about legal and financial matters, who celebrated each small victory in the process of rebuilding our lives. Maria, a 76-year-old woman whose daughter had stolen her Social Security checks for 3 years, became a particularly close friend. She had also fought back through the legal system and won a measure of justice and restitution. Together, we learned to navigate the complicated emotions of loving children who had hurt us while also protecting ourselves from further harm. "You can love someone and still hold them accountable," Maria would say during our coffee dates. In fact, sometimes holding someone accountable is the most loving thing you can do, even if they don't recognize it at the time. This wisdom helped me understand that my decision to prosecute David and Robert wasn't motivated by revenge or hatred. It was motivated by a refusal to enable their destructive behavior. By allowing them to face the consequences of their actions, I was giving them an opportunity to learn and change, even if they chose not to take advantage of that opportunity. The workshops I began teaching at the Senior Center grew out of my desire to prevent others from experiencing what I had endured. The first time I stood in front of a room full of elderly people and told my story, my hands shook and my voice wavered, but I could see the recognition in their eyes, the relief of hearing someone articulate experiences they had kept secret. I thought I was the only one, woman after woman would tell me after the presentations. I thought there was something wrong with me for feeling uncomfortable with my son's financial demands. These conversations reminded me that isolation is one of the key factors that allows elder abuse to continue. When victims feel alone and ashamed, they're less likely to seek help or even recognize that they're being abused. By speaking openly about my experience, I was helping to break down that isolation and create a community of support and resistance. The workshops evolved to include practical information about legal rights, financial protections, and warning signs of abuse. But they also included something equally important: permission to value yourself, to set boundaries, to expect respectful treatment regardless of your age or relationship to the person mistreating you. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions or financial problems, I would tell them. Your job is to live your own life with dignity and purpose. Anyone who asks you to sacrifice your security or well-being for their benefit is asking too much. These messages were as important for me to say as they were for the participants to hear. Each time I articulated these principles, I reinforced them in my own mind and heart. The media attention that followed the trials was unexpected and initially uncomfortable. I had never sought publicity, and being described as the Queen's grandmother who fought back against family financial abuse felt strange and overwhelming. But the interviews and articles served an important purpose. They brought national attention to the issue of elder financial abuse, helping other victims understand that they weren't alone and encouraging family members to be more vigilant about protecting elderly relatives. I received hundreds of letters and emails from people who had seen my story in the news. Some were from other victims sharing their own experiences. Some were from adult children asking for advice about potentially abusive situations they had observed in their own families. Some were from social workers, lawyers, and law enforcement officers thanking me for speaking out about an issue they dealt with regularly, but that received too little public attention. Each of these communications reminded me that my personal tragedy had become something larger, a catalyst for important conversations about family dynamics, aging, and financial abuse. The worst thing that had ever happened to me had been transformed into a force for positive change. As I write this final section of my story, I'm sitting on the balcony of my Los Angeles condo, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. James is inside preparing dinner. He's become quite a good cook since we've been together, and I can hear him humming softly as he works. It's a sound of contentment that fills me with peace. Tomorrow we're driving up the coast to visit Sarah and her new partner, a kind woman named Lisa who makes Sarah laugh in ways I haven't heard since she was a child. Next month we're flying to Ireland for that trip I mentioned, to trace my grandparents' steps through the small villages they left behind when they sought a better life in America. These plans, these relationships, these simple pleasures, they exist because I made the difficult decision to fight for myself when everything seemed hopeless. They exist because I chose to believe that I deserved better treatment, even when the people who were supposed to love me had convinced me otherwise. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, I want you to know that the same future is possible for you. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it is possible. You don't have to accept mistreatment from anyone, including family members. You don't have to sacrifice your security or dignity to maintain relationships with people who don't value you. You are worthy of respect, care, and consideration. You are worthy of relationships that add to your life rather than drain from it. You are worthy of financial security and emotional peace. You are worthy of happiness, regardless of your age or circumstances. The journey from victim to survivor to thriver is long and sometimes difficult, but it's worth taking. On the other side of that journey, you'll find the most important relationship of all, the one with yourself. And once you have that, everything else becomes possible. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my journey. Thank you for caring about the issues that matter to vulnerable people in our society. And if you found value in what I've shared, please pass it along to someone who might need to hear it. Together, we can break the silence that allows abuse to flourish and build a community of strength, support, and survival. Remember, it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to discover that your best days might still be ahead of you.